following was written by Jeff Smith and Mike Cerrito. Voting is aggression. True or false? Well, to answer that, let's first ask, what is aggression? Aggression is the initial force used against a peaceful individual. It is often used as a mechanism of implementing and enforcing goals. Not to be confused with self-defense, which is the secondary use of force to defend against aggression. To be clear, the force of aggression happens first, and the force of self-defense happens second. To be clear, those two forces are opposites, whereas self-defense is the moral force against aggression, and aggression is the immoral force that violates a person or persons. The right of aggression is the belief that an individual, a group, or the government has a legal right to use aggression, force, coercion, violence against any and all individuals. The right of aggression includes the right to punish those individuals that do not obey the commands of the aggressionists. To be clear, no one has a right of aggression against peaceful individuals. Initial aggression is always wrong. To be clear, all individuals shall live their own lives as they themselves see fit, so long as they do no harm to the life, liberty, and/or property of other peaceful individuals. Voting is an aggression, and the following explains why. The argument against voting. The act of voting is an aggression upon the life, liberty, and property of other peaceful individuals. To be clear, people vote, then elected politicians write arbitrary laws, statutes, dictates, orders, and then government's armed thugs initiate aggression to enforce those laws, statutes, dictates, orders on innocent, peaceful people whom don't comply and/or don't consent to being ruled by government. We should note, no individual has the authority to make laws that their neighbor or anyone else must obey. To be clear, right now, we're not talking about laws against theft or murder. To be clear, we don't need governments to write laws against theft or murder because those laws already exist. They are called natural laws, and they pre-exist governments by thousands of years. To be clear, right now, we are talking about government's seemingly endless arbitrary laws that are often called victimless crime laws. To be clear, these are laws that government can't produce a legitimate victim when those laws are broken. To be clear, some examples of arbitrary laws are traffic violations, gambling, public drunkenness, homelessness, panhandling, prostitution, or you can't let your grass grow more than 6 inches tall. Albeit, some of these alleged offenses might be contrary to cultural norms. However, we must note again, there is no victim, therefore, they cannot be legitimate crimes. So let's ask, then how is it morally acceptable for any individual to delegate authority they don't have to someone else, such as a politician? To be clear, it's not morally acceptable, and it's fallacy. To be clear, no one can legitimately delegate rights or authority they don't have. By voting, an individual literally advocates the use of force, aggression, coercion, violence, via proxy using government action. It is ludicrous that anyone should have that right to vote against your life, liberty, or property without your consent. It is ludicrous to believe that you have a right to use aggression upon other individuals. The act of voting grants false legitimacy to the idea that it's acceptable for the majority, collective, to use the coercive arm of government to impose their will on the minority individual using force or threat of force, and for that reason, it is immoral to vote. Voting makes the voter no better than the aggression-based politicians they vote for. If one votes, one participates. If one participates, one condones and endorses the process and subsequently what those elected representatives do and say in your name. The act of voting makes one an accessory to the criminal actions committed by those politicians, government's armed thugs, and regulations you voted for. We should also point out that the act of not voting is not meant to be a direct attack on the aggression-based government, and instead it's quite the contrary. To be clear, not voting is an individual's moral decision not to aggress upon the life, liberty, and/or property of another peaceful individual. In contrast, voting makes one an accessory to the government's tyrannical atrocities and war crimes. That voting only supports the aggression-based government, and that is something a free individual does not partake in. The decision not to vote removes one from the guilt and blame for those same crimes. A non-voter emerges from the electoral process with a clean conscience because they can legitimately proclaim that what the elected representatives subsequently say and do after they have gained power is not done in their name, not with their permission, and not with their encouragement. To be clear, not voting is an act of resistance, of defiance, of rebellion, an awakening message that you no longer willingly accept your slavery to the government or to anyone else. To be clear, not voting is an educational tool of helping others learn and realize that voting does not lead to liberty and peace, but in fact, voting instead supports the government, tyranny, and war. We should note, participation in the system, in example voting, ignorantly reinforces the idea that people can't live together without violent control. Participation in the system, in example voting, implies that the majority knows what's best for everyone. Participation in the system implies that the majority, mob rule, knows what's best for the individual and will enforce its views on the rest of society with the threat of violence. That's not freedom, that's slavery. Voting sends a false signal to the elected politicians that the voter approves of all their policies. Voting therefore encourages them and the government as a whole to continue what they have been doing for the last 230 plus years, in other words, tyranny and war. Ponder this. If the outcome of a vote is unknown, then voting is tantamount to gambling. If the outcome of a vote is known, then voting is futile. Now let's ask, should people who know more about game shows, sports, reality TV, and celebrities, rather than matters of any real importance like economics, political philosophy, history, logic, critical thinking, liberty, peace, etc., be in a position to vote and influence the lives of others? I think not. And let's also point out that even people who do know more about economics, political philosophy, history, logic, critical thinking, liberty, peace, and etc., still aren't qualified to vote and therefore forcibly influence the lives of others. Now let's look at the arguments for voting that voters often make. Voting is okay if we only vote against items that are aggression-based. Response: that might be okay if everyone voted that way, but they don't. There are a whole lot of people who do not believe that you should be allowed to be free. Instead, they believe that you need to be controlled. Thus, the bulk of our tyranny is due to voting in aggression-based politicians, regulations, etc. In the U.S., we have been voting for over 230 plus years, and we have suffered from tyranny and permanent war the whole time. Historically, voting has never made much of a difference on how government acts, and instead government merely uses the votes of voters as excuses to falsely justify using aggression. To be clear, Government does what it feels it needs or wants to do, hence lots of tyranny and war. The people have the power to vote themselves free and control government tyranny via voting. Response: voting reinforces the idea that the people have the power rather than the largely unaccountable, corrupt bureaucrats and politicians who make the rules, laws, ordinances, and policies. The government is the Republican and Democrat and Libertarian political parties, and in the last 150 years they have shown no interest in allowing us our freedom. We are simply resource slaves for their power and their wealth. We can vote for more freedom. Response: if that were the case, wouldn't we be a lot freer than we are now? To get initiatives on the ballot, you have to meet the requirements and permissions of the state. It has been shown on numerous occasions throughout history that the government and states can legally reject what we, the people, vote for. And that actually makes voting irrelevant. Voting is the people's way to influence politics. Response: so the majority of the people voted for the forever tyranny and permanent war policy our government has retained for over 150 years? Doesn't that actually mean that voting is dangerous to liberty and peace? Indeed it is. Believing that your vote will influence the politicians and the ruling class to govern by the will of the people is utopian. The only way to truly delegitimize the system is by not voting. Those that choose not to vote do so because they know that no one has the moral right to do harm to the liberty of another. Voting for the lesser of two evils is the best way to obtain liberty a little at a time. Response: voting for the lesser of two evils gets us evil. Voting this way for the last 200 plus years is precisely why we live under an authoritarian police state. Time to take a stand. Choose. Either you advocate a society whereby people are free to voluntarily interact with one another, or you advocate the use of force or threat of force against innocent, peaceful individuals in order to make them comply with your opinions and preferences.